All right. Welcome back to Ask Coach Nate, episode number 27. Today, we're going to give you some tips on how to improve threshold power. So, Nate, why don't you start by defining threshold power?
That's a great question. I love it. So it really depends on who you talk to or what paper you're reading, how people define it. But because it doesn't necessarily matter precisely how you define it if you're know vaguely what you're talking about. So in general, most people regard threshold power as something resembling maximal lactate steady state. So it's as you go up in intensity, if you're below your threshold, you'll have some lactate in your blood that's in measurable amounts, but it's not that much, and you can sustain those intensities for a long time without any change in your blood lactate. As you get to your threshold, it inches up, but once you get past your threshold, it starts to accumulate at higher rates. So in general, that is going to be about the intensity or power that you can do for an hour. But that being said, though, the exact level of lactate that you would have if you went out and did a 1 hour time trial is not going to be the same for different people. And the way that people try to measure it or define it in different studies, or if they're using power meter and they're not actually getting lactate testing, how they define it will vary a lot. So I think that to simplify and keep it clear and to the point without requiring you to go get lactate testing, without requiring you to do a very particular singular FTP protocol, because there's different ones, I would just say how hard you can go for an hour. So if you're going to go up a 1 hour climb, if you're going to do a 1 hour time trial and you're doing a steady hard effort, obviously there's going to be some fluctuation in power, but just how hard you can go for an hour. And that's going to map very well onto your maximal lactate steady state. And it will also correlate with most so-called FTP tests, even though there's going to be some variability with the result that you would get if you do different FTP type testing protocols.
Right. So everyone's heard of FTP, so functional threshold power, which is measured by power. And I do remember when the heart rate meter was perhaps more popular, you had lactate threshold tests, which is what you're describing, right, about your lactate acid levels. And that's ultimately, they're actually two different measures of a similar thing. So there's a ton of ways to measure this. I guess my question, or what I didn't fully understand when I got into this, was define hard for an hour.
As hard as you can go for an hour.
Yeah.
So if
as hard as you can go, right? So that's what I think people don't normally get from this.
Yeah.
At least my interpretation was as hard as you can go, which means at the end of 1 hour, you should not be able to go very much. And so I think for the most part, when I describe this part to people, that's what they go, oh, maybe I didn't go hard enough, right? And that's what was a big game changer for me when I was we're talking 1 hour,
really hard,
all out, as hard as you can go, to the point where at the end of the hour, you basically don't have anything left in the tank.
Yeah. And so for people that do have access to long time trials, whether it's half an hour or an hour, the experience is similar. Obviously the power is maybe just a few watts less if you're doing an hour versus 30 or 40 minutes. But that experience of, the first 5 minutes don't feel that hard, but you're settling in, your heart rate is rising. 10, 15, 20 minutes in, you feel like you're working very hard and it's hurting, but it's not the worst. By 40 minutes in, you kind of want to shoot yourself, but you can keep going. By 60 minutes, you hopefully blow up at the finish line if you paced it right, kind of.
Okay, that definition, that works. So I guess I did a 1 hour time trial once, and when I got to the finish line, an official looked at me and said, "Do you need medical attention?" And I knew I had nailed it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. So we got, I think a layman's definition of threshold power and functional threshold power for over an hour.
Yeah.
So what are some tips to improve that?
And just to be clear, functional threshold power usually is referring to Hunter Allen and Andrew Coggin's book, and they describe doing a 20-minute so-called FTP test, because it's just easier to do a short power test. Practically, it's easier to find a stretch of road. Practically, for most athletes, it's just easier to fit a 20-minute test in rather than an hour-long test. A lot of people do this protocol incorrectly, and they just go out and do a 20-minute time trial. where the way they describe it in their book and in their framework is that you're supposed to do a maximal 5-minute effort and then a maximal 20-minute effort. And the 20-minute effort obviously is going to be a little bit less power if you did that 5-minute effort first. But if you skip the 5-minute effort and you just do a 20-minute effort, you'll get a few watts for free just because you don't have any fatigue. Like, and it is significant. So even if it's just like 3% or 5%, like that's a huge difference in the 20-minute power. And then you're supposed to multiply that by 0.95 to get your FTP. But that's generally going to be true for like highly trained people that are in really pretty good shape, and generally like pros will have maybe like a 4 to 6% drop from their 20-minute to their 60-minute power. But a lot of like less trained athletes or novice athletes will see like 7, 10%, or even a little bit more. So, you know, if you do an FTP test and you think like, oh, 0.95, my threshold power, like my FTP is 250, but you know from experience that you cannot hold 250 for an hour, that's not your threshold. Like that's an inflated number, and it's not going to get the rest of your like zones or targets for workouts set accurately, because you'll just be doing too much power all the time. And you'll see this a lot of times with people that, for example, do like so-called sweet spot workouts, where you'll see that they do like 20-minute efforts and their heart rate just slowly drifts up and they're able to execute, but you can tell that they're riding like at threshold instead of at like 92 or 94% of threshold, because their assessment of what their FTP is maybe a little bit inflated. So it's just good to like be kind of honest with yourself about what your power, what your capabilities actually are.
Like it. Be honest. Yeah, I think I had never heard the 5-minute warm up to the 20-minute. I've actually never heard that. And I've done a lot of these, because what made me think was like, my 5-minute power is like my best, and if I did my all out 5-minute power, I have nothing in the tank to do a 20-minute test after that. Like there's no way. Like I remember I did this 5-minute, and I've never been able to duplicate. I did it years ago, and I got like a crazy number, which I was really proud of. It took everything I had to do it, and the thought of having to do a 20-minute test at that level, I don't think I could have executed that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point. But in any case, a lot of people have report overestimated FTP numbers, and that actually came up in a conversation with a client recently, which was part of the inspiration for this discussion. They had an idea in their head that their FTP was like maybe 20 watts higher than what it actually is, and so their assessment of like what they should be doing for 10 or 15-minute intervals was a little bit inflated, and so their perception of like how hard things were supposed to be and what they should be capable of was a little bit skewed, just because their extrapolation was maybe inflated prior to
that. Just explain that part. Like, so why is there so much focus on this test, right? Like what is this number used for, and why is it important that you get the number that's accurate, right? Like you don't want a number that's inflated. It's ultimately not good for your training.
Yeah. So if it's off by like 2%, it's not a big deal. Or like if you know from experience like how your training's been going, what's a reasonable number for you for right now, like you can, if you're very attentive to how your experience of your body, you train with maybe power and heart rate, you can probably execute training very well and just adjust your expected power for your like 5-minute or 20-minute intervals or whatever it is accordingly. But if you're just purely like staring at your power meter and you're basing everything like down to the number based on an FTP test, if it's 5% too high, that's going to mean that when you're doing tempo, you're almost doing like a threshold interval. And if you're doing threshold, but it's like definitely always over threshold, maybe you're actually doing training that you want to be at a lower lactate number so that you can just focus on the purely aerobic side of things, but you're actually like pushing into higher lactate numbers because you're like 3% over your actual threshold power instead of 2% under it. And so it can really like change what energy systems you're using, change how much training you can tolerate, and whether you can do like just 3 intervals or you can do 5. And maybe the goal would actually be to do 5 by whatever the interval is. But obviously, if you're overshooting it by like 10 or 20 watts, you're not going to be able to. So you're just completely changing your whole training if it's off by more than like 2%.
So what tips do you have for people to go out and do the test?
So you could do the actual 20-minute test, which is like generally a pretty good test. But I would maybe pad it a little bit and discount your 20-minute to 60-minute by a couple percent and maybe do like 93% of your 20-minute just as a starting point. So it's better to like slightly underestimate and go just 2% easier on all your efforts and target like, a few watts less than it is to overshoot. Because like if you're doing 95% effort, 98% effort, you're going to get 99% of the gains. But if you're doing 102% of what you should be doing or what you want to be doing, you'll more quickly like reach some kind of a peak and then kind of plateau and stop seeing as much like continued gains in the long run. But yeah, warm up very thoroughly, do a 5-minute effort that's very hard, and then cruise around for like 10 or 15 minutes, and then do a 20-minute effort that's very hard, and then take 5 to 7% less than that 20-minute effort rather than the fresh effort. Or you can just integrate it into your training. So like for me, I don't frequently do tests like that. During the winter, when I'm not training as much volume, I might go do some ramp tests on the trainer just because it's like a fun thing to do. And you can see bigger changes from week to week, especially if I'm riding the trainer a lot more and I'm just getting used to that as opposed to riding outside. But I often will do workouts where it's like maybe 3 by 20 minutes or 4 by 15 minutes. And in the course of normal training, you're not totally fresh. So you might be only operating at like 97 or 98% of what you're capable of. But doing an hour of riding at around your threshold, if you can do, let's say, 3 by 20 minutes or 4 by 15 minutes at 250 watts, for example, generally I would regard that to be really close to your actual threshold power. Because if you can imagine doing 3 by 20 minutes at 250, when you're not fresh, if you are totally fresh, you could probably do close to an hour at 250, like going up Diablo or something like that. So I'll often extrapolate from just the normal course of hard training.
I mean, people could go. What do you think about doing like a full 1 hour test?
I think that's great. If it is in line,
there are some places you can do that.
Yeah, so if it's in line with your training and it's not just like if you're a cross-country mountain bike racer and all your races are an hour 20 or less, and you're not like a world-class athlete, you're just training like 6 or 7 hours a week, doing an hour as hard as you can is probably, it's something that you could do a few times a year, and it could be fun, and it could be a good workout, and it could give you a more accurate number. But since your racing is all about aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity and like neuromuscular strength, it's maybe not as specific as it would be for like a road racer who does stage races with long climbs and time trials, for example. So like for the racing that I did when I was racing professionally, where I was focused on stage races and time trials and long climbs, like that was something that I would do pretty routinely. But if you're a Cat 3 crit racer and none of your races are longer than an hour, or you're a mountain biker and all of your races are an hour, then it might not be worth the effort. But it is the gold standard for checking your FTP or your threshold power.
Right. So 1 hour is the standard. Yeah, I guess I would say, like, having done a lot of different stuff, like I would recommend people go out and try to find a place to do an hour time trial, because it's something they should experience, and then it will help you gauge whether your FTP test is accurate, right? So doing a couple of climbs that are really long and close to an hour, you get a much better sense of like, is this really something I could do for an hour? And that's why I started with like, what is hard for an hour? Because I think when a lot of people hear that, they're like, they think, oh, they're gonna go hard. But when you're like, you press them, you're like, no, you got to go all out, where like you couldn't go anymore. They're like, oh, that's what you mean by hard. It's a different kind of like perception of hard. So great. What about doing it like on an indoor bike, or and you described the trainer or Peloton. Do you recommend that?
I mean, indoors, it's harder to get the same amount of power that you can get outdoors. But if you are, for example, focused on time trialing, the restriction in your movement when you're on the trainer does force you to use certain muscles only, and you can't like get out of the saddle and throw your bike around, which happens maybe if you're climbing and you like move around a lot more on the bike and you throw your weight into it more. So in general, you'll see a little bit less power when you're on the trainer, partly because of your movement, partly because you probably are going to be overheating in a way that you won't outside, unless you're comparing like indoors in the winter versus outdoors in the summer, perhaps. But it will be a good test for like what you can do in the saddle, and especially for a time trialist where you really want to be in the saddle the whole time, not moving an inch the whole time, so you're staying in your aero position. That can be very useful, but it's like probably going to artificially have slightly lower numbers by like a couple percent than if you're riding outside and you're able to like get out of the saddle and like move your bike around and mix it up a little bit more.
So, what tips do you have for people to improve threshold power?
So,
okay, so we defined it, right?
Yeah. So if we wanted to, do better at an hour-long time trial or hill climb, let's just say that's like the goal. It depends on how far out it is. Long term, you don't want to just focus on doing like threshold intervals, because if that's the only thing you do, you might get better at that over the course of like a few weeks or even a couple of months, depending on what your fitness is at right now. But you want to include other intensities in your overall training program, so that if you're targeting an event that's like 6 months out, like you want to work on your neuromuscular strength, your endurance, your general aerobic conditioning, and as well as like aerobic capacity and threshold type workouts. So you have like a good foundation to like reach a peak. But as you get closer and closer to whatever your goal event is, and let's say you're 1 to 2 months out, whatever it is that you've done kind of building up to that point, in that last 1 to 2 months, you really want to focus in on basically your target intensity plus or minus 10%. So you might focus on doing some threshold intervals that are like 15 or 20 minutes at your target, like 1 hour pace. And you'll want to do some shorter intervals that are like 4 to 8 minutes long at 10% or more above that pace. So if you're doing like, let's say 8-minute intervals, maybe it's like 110% of your hour-long pace. If you're doing 4-minute intervals, maybe it's like 115% or something like that. And you want to do some extended efforts that are just a little below your target pace. So for example, I remember when I did the Diablo Challenge like multiple years in a row earlier in my racing, the last couple months, I would focus on doing like full gas 4-minute VO2 max intervals. I would go out and ride Diablo hard, like the full distance. And I would do some longer rides that mixed in a lot of like tempo and high tempo climbing. So I might do like 5 or 6 hours. And on a lot of the 10 to 25-minute climbs, I would go like 90% of my Diablo pace.
Sounds good. What else do you think people should know about threshold training in general, right? I mean, I think you described some things here about like above and below. Like, how do people think about that and utilize that?
So I feel like a lot of people focus mostly or exclusively on like the metabolics of cycling, and they talk about like, I don't know, carbohydrate usage and oxygen consumption. But I think that sometimes people fail to recognize the importance of our nervous system, both our ability to access motor units and like our strength and strength endurance. Over the years, I've definitely seen with myself, and a lot of athletes have seen, that doing strength work actually helps you to perform better at time trials. And it's like going to the gym, you're not increasing your aerobic enzymes because you're doing some squats, you're doing some leg extensions, whatever. Like it's like mostly anaerobic work, but that's not the point. The point is to train your nervous system to be able to better access those motor units so that you can just fire more muscles and have more like neurological fatigue resistance. So regardless of the metabolics of what's going on, like you need your nervous system to be able to like push those muscles. And some people naturally have really good strength, and going to the gym is not going to benefit them as much. Some people, like myself, can see a big increase in strength if they go to the gym versus not going to the gym. So for me, if I'm really trying to be in good shape for racing generally, or for time trialing, or for climbing, I do want to do strength work so that I have much better neurological recruitment of those motor units. Also, more on the central side, it's really helpful for your brain to know what it feels like and know what to anticipate when you're doing like an hour-long time trial or an hour-long effort or a half hour, whatever your target is. Like if you don't practice that, you're not going to be able to execute as well as you can on race day, because like your brain is like maybe you're used to doing 20-minute intervals. And this is a really common thing that I see as a huge shortcoming for a lot of athletes that do want to do time trials or do want to do stage races where there are really long climbs. Or nowadays, like with gravel rides and stuff like Leadville and like the Tahoe Trail 100, where there are like 30, 40, 60-minute climbs that you repeat maybe multiple times throughout the course. Like if you're not used to doing hour-long efforts in training, your brain's not going to kind of know how to compute how hard you can go. And it's always going to be holding back because your brain is trying to prevent you from overexerting yourself. That's one of its primary functions. So it's like if I go out to Diablo and I haven't ridden hard to the top for months, let's say, going hard the first time, and then if I go back again, like a week or two later, and then a week or two after that, I'll probably drop over a minute just in that first 2 or 3 times, just because my fitness hasn't fundamentally changed, but my brain's ability to compute how hard I'm comfortable going for that length of time changes pretty drastically. So you don't have to do that like every week. You don't have to go full gas for an hour, every week or every other week. But you do want to do that sometimes, especially as you're getting closer to your event. So you know what it feels like to go hard for an hour, or you know what it feels like to go hard for half an hour, like after 4 hours of riding. People that front load all of their intervals at the beginning of their workouts, people that never do anything longer than 20 minutes are really not going to be able to get all their body has to offer. And that's a lot, like partly that's the training of it and like the physiological changes of like enzyme density in your muscles, but a lot of it's also just your brain's ability to endure a certain level of discomfort. Like that is a trainable feature of our nervous system. And then again, outside of like just the training and like looking at like your cardiac output or whatever, I think a lot of people forget that oxygen is always transported and absorbed in our body with iron. And there's good evidence to suggest that nutrition, and specifically like iron intake and vitamin B12 intake, is not sufficient for most athletes that are training at a high level to have the most hemoglobin in their blood that they can have. And their like oxygen carrying capacity can go up if they supplement with iron. And I don't necessarily tell any of my athletes or people generally to like take any supplement, but there's good evidence to support that that is a very worthwhile activity for runners and cyclists and triathletes. And generally speaking, most of them have better performance if they do take supplemental iron, because like no matter what your diet is like, you're probably not getting as much as your body would put to use if you had it available.
All right. Well, what's the bottom line regarding threshold training?
I mean, you need to be clear on what it is that your goal is, so you're training kind of specifically for it. But as far as threshold training goes, you want to, like, if you're trying to perform your very best for some sort of threshold specific type of event, like a time trial or a hill climb, you definitely need to work above threshold to maximize your aerobic capacity by doing those like 4 or 8 minute intervals that are like pretty full gas, or by doing something like Tabata intervals where it's like hard for 40 seconds, easy for 20 seconds, or hard for 30 seconds and easy for 30 seconds, and doing like long sets of those. And you want to increase your tolerance to working right around threshold. And I find it's very helpful, not necessarily to do like the bulk of your work, like some people would advocate, but for doing some workouts where you do a lot of work just below threshold. So there are some people that are in favor of doing really high quantities of so-called sweet spot training. And I think there's a place for doing that type of intensity sometimes in your training program and for some workouts, but that shouldn't be all that you're doing, even though some people do seem to advocate for that. If you did that, you would be missing out on your aerobic capacity, and you'd be missing out on the skill of riding right at your threshold and dealing with those higher levels of lactate.
All right. Well, I'm all pumped to go do my FTP test now. I haven't done one in a while. Well, it's great. Hey, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks. Bye.